A couple of months ago, I posted a video about Stephen Brearey and his role in the miscarriage of justice that put Lucy Letby in prison for crimes she did not commit. And in that video, I talked about the God complex and about how it seemed to me that Stephen Brearey could not face his own limitations. And so turned them outward and blamed somebody else for the mistakes he made on the neonatal unit that he ran at the Countess of Chester Hospital, which eventually led to Lucy Letby's conviction for murders and attempted murders, and then a sentencing of 15 whole life orders for those crimes, which again, she did not commit. And some documents were released yesterday that shed some light, I think, on this aspect of Stephen Breary's personality and pathology. And I just wanted to briefly read it to you and perhaps comment along the way as I see fit. So let's start with Myers's questioning of Stephen Breary about baby O. Starting here, he says, we're going to get more dates in the chronology as we go along. I'm not expecting you to recall all dates, but can you just help with the Countess of Chester neonatal unit was redesignated from a level 2 to a level 1 on 7 July 2016, wasn't it? And Stephen Breary answers no. Huh. And so Myers responds, what date do you say that happened? And then Stephen Breary says, well, first thing to say, it was our decision to do it, do the change, based on a pure decision in terms of looking after staff and their welfare, because everybody was very stressed and upset by all these events. Now, first of all, I don't understand what this has to do with the date that Ben Myers asked for. All Ben Myers said was it happened on this date, correct? So Stephen Breary's response to Ben Myers' question about the date has nothing to do with the date at all, because his mind immediately went to the threat of being reminded that the unit that he led had to be downgraded because of the situation on it. We all know, everybody knows, the Thirlwall inquiry knows, he knows, everyone on the unit knows that that unit was downgraded because of the deaths that had occurred because of poor care on that ward. That's based on the RCPCH report, the CQC report, McPartland's report. Everybody who came in before Dowie Evans showed his face said that there was poor communication, sepsis problems, pseudomonas, not enough room, and namely, not enough ward rounds done by Stephen Breary himself. So he's lying when he suggests that it was a decision on his part because people were upset about what had happened. That's just a pure lie. And we all know it now. And it comes from that ego, that inability to accept that his unit had to be downgraded because he wasn't up to snuff for the care of these infants. So I'll continue. That's the reason we reduced the number of cot spaces from 16 to 12 capacity and reduced the gestational limit from 27 weeks to 32 weeks. Lest any of you think I am not the best doctor in the world, and even perhaps on par with God. Please remember, this was our decision to soothe the nerves, he's suggesting, of everybody else on the unit. Meanwhile, this is a man who is screaming murder at the top of his lungs for years. So does he really care about the comfort and emotional health of the people around him? Don't think so. So then Myers says, it's the date I'm after at the moment, Dr. Breary. And Breary says, I'm only saying this because you've said level 1 and level 2. we still maintained the high dependency cot spaces in the unit, which wouldn't make us a level 1 unit. So actually, we were somewhere between a level 1 and level 2 unit. And actually, those changes were made to look after staff at the time and just to take a bit of pressure off everybody whilst events settled down a little, which they clearly did not because there were no, which they clearly did, excuse me, because there were no more events after Nurse Letby left the unit. So he's concocting a story here, as he had been doing for years around Lucy Letby. Oh, we only slowed things down a bit for everybody on the unit because everybody was so upset. And then look what happened. Everything changed after Nurse Letby left, not acknowledging that in fact that unit was downgraded. It was fully downgraded based on recommendation by the RCPCH. It had nothing to do with his decision or anyone else on the unit feeling better. Let's all remember that. So Myers says, yes, but it raised the minimum age of gestation became 32 weeks, didn't it? And Brearey says, well, a large majority of the cases in this trial are babies over 32 weeks. Just like Dowie Evans, Brearey here is refusing to accept his own limitation. He can't admit it. He has to point out that the babies in this case are over 32 weeks to do two things. To show that these are babies I've always worked with. My abilities weren't being questioned. I've always worked with babies this age. So it wasn't a big deal to me anyway. So I don't know why you're asking this. And then secondly, to try to drive home the idea that these babies were old enough to have survived and that Lucy Letby was the cause of their deaths, when we all know she was not. He was. So Myers says, yes, but demands across the unit change. You note the unit didn't take babies under 32 weeks after it was redesignated. And Brearey says, it was the staff during doing the same job, and there were no sudden collapses, as I have said. And Myers interrupts and says, and then Goss being Goss, interjects and says, just let him finish. Let the righteous doctor finish, Justice Goss says. And so Brearey continues. As I've said, the staffing did not have a significant effect on the events that happened before that change. I don't know how he could claim that, but I guess he has to for his own conscience. So Mr. Myers says, but you are not taking the same volume of babies at the same acuity, are you, as a fact? And Brearey says, that's true. And Myers says, that's true. And Brearey says, yes. So Myers says, because the unit is then taking babies from 32 weeks and above, not 27, 28 weeks and above. And Brearey says, although we would still stabilize babies less than 32 weeks for the last 6 years, of which nothing's happened to those babies born less than 32 weeks, because you can't predict birth sometimes. And babies are born less than 32 weeks in your unit because that's the nature of obstetrics and maternity. So somehow here he's suggesting that this was not a decision, it sounds to me, and that these babies were born on the unit because of the nature of healthcare and mothers who were already on the unit with their infants and it was not feasible to move them, etc. I don't really know what that has to do with Myers's question, except that it seems to me Brearey is trying to avoid it. So Myers says, I'm not trying to be rude, but I've asked 3 times now that the age of gestation that the unit is then able to take babies, save those that are born when it can't be stopped, is 32 weeks. Brearey says, yes. And Myers says, that's what changed, isn't it? From 27 up to 32. And Brearey finally says, yes. And Myers says, and the other thing that I asked you is, what is the date when that took place? And Brearey says, that was early July 2016. And Myers says, I had suggested the 7th. And Brearey says, I can't challenge that. I haven't got the date. Now, I'm not sure what else we need to see here from Stephen Brearey to help us to understand where he was probably coming from when he accused Lucy Letby of murder. Because I think it's quite clear that this is a man who is locked into his own genius and perfection and inability to fail and need to be right and inability to change and certainty and lack of curiosity and quite frankly, incredible limitation was something he could not accept in himself. Most of us can't, but this man had lives in his hands and he was taking the life of an innocent woman while being unable to face these aspects of himself. And I just think this exchange is so telling of that, so scary and maddening, and shows us exactly who Stephen Brearey is, if we didn't already know.